So thanks for coming here also at 7 at night. Really awesome that anybody showed up at all. I'm really grateful to see some people. So I want to talk about free and open source software, which is a pretty wide open topic to try to discuss. But mostly I just wanted to give sort of a slightly technical but not very technical overview of how you can get your foot in the door to contributing to what I consider to be two of the flagship free and open source projects, the Linux kernel and Firefox browser. So the reason I want to do this talk also is that when I was first trying to get involved in open source, I knew about GitHub, but the idea of submitting a patch to a mailing list or trying to work on a big project that wasn't just some person's Python script really intimidated me. I didn't even know how to broach it. So hopefully this talk will help make it easier for somebody down the line to get involved in one of these projects. About me, you can see my GitHub. I write poetry about the Linux kernel, which is my slightly embarrassing micro claim to fame. I work at Mozilla on release engineering. So if you download Firefox, that's my team that gets it all built and put out on the mirrors and all that nice stuff. I also like to roller skate. Roller derby is happening in Nashville right now. It's champ, so you should check that out. And I don't make pretty slide decks, which you're going to see over and over again.
Can you explain the GIF?
That's Lady Gaga, and she's just making a funny face. And I feel a little awkward talking about myself, so I figured it was apropos. So when people talk about free and open source software, they usually don't say it all like that because it's a mouthful. They say FOSS. So I'm going to break FOSS down. F is for freedom, and Richard Stallman likes to say free as in freedom, not free as in beer, but it can be free as in beer if you so choose. The idea is that if users don't have control over the software that's running on their computer, then the software has control of them, which is, I guess, a big and scary thing to say, but a lot of security-minded people here, I'm sure you can run with that way of thinking. OS, open source. So there's a subtle difference between free and open source that I think a lot of people don't see. Richard Stallman will get very mad if you say he's the father of open source. You got to say free and open source. Open source means that the source code is out there for anybody to look at, but here's the trick. If Microsoft made Windows, if they made the kernel published so that you could read every line of code, and you made some changes to it, unless they've given you the freedom to share those changes, it's all for naught. If you fix some vulnerability but it's against the law for you to publish it, what's the point? And I think that's the practical aspect of free and open source. And so another thing about open source software development is that it's very different from the kind of top-down development that companies would have done in the past. Well, still do somewhat. It's a little bit archaic these days, I think. I think most big companies are taking the sort of open source type of methodology to heart with developing new software projects, but there's a sort of closed source model that's very top down, and then there's this bizarre model where people are going off and forming little groups or going off in a corner and building features and then presenting them to each other and trying to form a quorum and get their patches in a code base. And that's the bizarre model. Oh, look, an ad. I don't know how that happened.
I blame my children.
Oh, no. How can I make that go away? This isn't my computer. I don't run Windows. No offense. Okay, so you should read this book if you're interested in the history of free and open source software, The Cathedral and the Bazaar. It was sort of a seminal book. It's a little outdated now, but it's still an interesting read, I think. Here's a video that explains the difference between free and open source, straight from the people who really started the movement themselves. But I'm not going to show that because I'm not sure I'm actually going to have time to waste 2 minutes. But you can look at it later. I tweeted the slides. So a lot of people like to say that open source is eating the world, or the software world that is. And that's because it's true. Most big companies these days have realized that they should open source their projects. And it's become very commonplace to see. But I would argue, and this fellow named Jared Whitehead would argue, that even today, being a part of an open source community is a political statement. And I find that appealing. That's part of the reason why I wanted to get involved with computers in the first place, is because I thought it was sort of radical, and it's the idea of doing things as a collective and doing things for the sake of sharing knowledge as opposed to empowering individuals and making wads of cash. Although, you can make wads of cash too. Greg, I can't say his last name very well. Greg Crowe-Hartman, he is the co-maintainer of the Linux kernel. He actually is the maintainer of the staging branch of the Linux kernel. So he's a big deal. And he was giving a talk, and he says by the time a person has contributed 5 patches to the Linux kernel, if they were doing it just for fun, they'll have a job working on the Linux kernel by that 5th patch. He guarantees it. And I think that rings true. In my own life, I think about 6 months ago, I open sourced a server framework, WebSocket server framework called Filtered WebSocket. I built it for fun. I put it up on pip, Python's package manager, and then companies, engineering managers at companies saw my project because they wanted to use it, and I was skipped to the end of a bunch of interviewing processes that were usually very long. And so that was pretty interesting to see that come to true, because I would see stuff in the past like what Greg KH said there, and I would think, yeah, right, if you went to Princeton or Stanford or something. But no, it's true for anybody. I went to Western Kentucky University. They don't care. If you work on open source, you'll do well. And so, given that, why doesn't every single person go and try to contribute to open source projects? We all know that they don't. And I think that's the point of this talk today, really, is that I think a lot of people do want to contribute and they like the idea of it, but they just don't know how to get started. Or they try to get started and somebody's a jerk to them. Or they write a patch and it gets rejected and they don't understand why. And actually there was a study, I don't know if you can see this, you can see it in the slide there, but somebody collected a bunch of studies actually, where they were looking at what's blocking people from getting integrated in open source projects. And they clustered it into 5 groups, but I'm really interested in 3 things. I'm really interested in the fact that a lot of people found it difficult or impossible to find a mentor. They found it difficult or impossible to set up their work environment, so they didn't even know how to go about creating a diff and sending it to somebody for review. And people had a lot of problems finding bugs to work on, which, I mean, think about it. You're a kid in university and, sorry?
I'm sorry, what's a diff?
A diff? So we'll talk about that in a bit, but a diff is when you work on software projects, it's all in text, right? And so you have a source file and you make some changes to it, you add something or change the name of something on a line, and a diff is just another text file that is only the changes you've made. So you can send that text file to somebody else and they can run a little program called patch, or they can use a version control program, and they can apply that diff and it will make their code base look like yours, and they can add it and remove it at will so that they can review your code. And that's sort of that's the unit that software development is measured in, is the diff.
A lot of people these days know these as pull requests on GitHub.
That's something I was going to get to in another slide. I think it's a real problem for people trying to work on older projects. For sure. Any other questions? Yeah. And the last thing is, I think that it's really hard for people to find bugs. Let's say you want to get involved in Linux kernel. Okay, great. Go find us a bug in the kernel that you want to fix. That's not going to happen. You've got to know where to look. Cool. So, touching on what we were just discussing, tools of the trade. Getting involved in open source has a few areas of prerequisite knowledge that don't directly have bearing on software development. And without those, you're not going to get very far. With them, everything's going to be so much easier. You're going to need to know about version control systems, so diffs, and need to know especially about Git and Mercurial. You'll need to know about using IRC, which here I've called real-time communication, and you're going to have to know about setting up email clients to use plain text only, which actually requires a few hoops these days because everybody's using Gmail, which doesn't play nice with text-only mailing lists. So Git and Mercurial, we'll talk about those a little bit. I recommend reading up on them in your spare time. I actually will attach in my sources a really great 15-minute tutorial that GitHub has, which will teach you how to use Git. So learn about Git and Mercurial. And then understanding what a diff is in the context of a text file and not a pull request on GitHub. I recommend actually generating a diff and then using a tool called patch if you use a Unix system and apply it with patch and not with Git. Just so you can get a feel for what's happening. IRC, so every open source project has an IRC channel or many IRC channels. I spend every day, all day in IRC channels, and sure enough, contributors will wander in and they'll ask questions. And me and my teammates will answer them and try to help them. And we're really happy that they're there. And so, yeah, if you're going to work on an open source project, first thing you should do, find out what IRC channels its contributors are living in and go and become a part of it. Also, if you want to use IRC effectively, you got to use a bouncer or you need to use something like IRC Cloud, and that's going to make it so that you're never offline and you can have nice things like history, so if people talk to you while you're away, you'll be able to see their messages. Basic features in other chat programs, but IRC is primitive on purpose, so using something like IRC Cloud will really help you out a lot. IRC Etiquette, this is very important. A lot of people, especially overzealous kids, will get IRC and they'll start running into rooms and spamming it with nonsense, and people will be mean to them and they'll have a bad opinion of IRC from then on out, and it will prevent them from getting involved in open source projects. And I've seen this before. I was talking to a fellow at a cafe. I had a Linux shirt on. He's like, oh, that's so cool, a Linux shirt. Like, how can I get involved in open source projects? And I told him, I said, well, here, join this IRC channel. There's a group of developers in Nashville. They're here all the time, and they'll help you learn the things you want to learn. He says, people on IRC are assholes.
But they are!
No. Nerds can be assholes. Nerds can be assholes, but I find that a lot of times it's just a misunderstanding all around. So do a little research. Don't just run in and start spamming people and expecting people to be your Google. Also, don't ask to ask. Just ask your questions. Behave as you would in real life. Act like you're verbalizing. And be patient with people. People are busy. People are using, if you don't know about bouncers or IRC Cloud, you might be like, oh, they're never going to see my messages unless I keep spamming them, because you won't realize that there's a history. But just be patient. People will get back to you. Async communication. So you want your client to be set up for plain text. That's very important if you're going to deal with sending patches around. So here's a link that will show you how to do that with Gmail. I recommend, if you're going to be sending in patches to a mailing list, you use a feature of Git, a Git plugin called Git Send Mail. It's made just for this. I mean, of course, Git was made by the folks who are working on Linux, so they added this feature for themselves. You can just have Git directly send an email with your diff. to people. It's much simpler. But you can also use Mutt. I think Mutt's sort of the de facto standard for a command line email client. It's all plain text, of course. If you have a Gmail account, I have a link here to a script that will take in your Gmail credentials and set up Mutt for you. And you can learn about using Mutt just by reading the manual pages. So now we get to, I guess, the fun part where we look at actually getting involved in these projects in some small way. First, by just submitting a bug. What does that look like? So both of these projects that I'm going to discuss use Bugzilla. Of course, Mozilla uses Bugzilla because they create it, but also the Linux kernel tracks their bugs with Bugzilla. Just go sign up for an account. It's really easy to use. We've all been using web applications for ages. Go sign up for an account and then click new bug if you have a bug. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Firefox is crashing and you think it's because it's not playing well with your new video driver. File a bug. It's really easy to do. You click new bug and it shows you all the different subsystems or projects that there are to choose from. You choose one and then you select a component. If you don't know what component, there's another category, and that will attach all the people who are interested in that to the email list, and then you just write a nice description of what your bug is. To do that, there are a few links here to documents that will help you write a good description, but too long, don't read. Include a screenshot if you can. That's always helpful, even if you don't think it would be. Just go ahead and do it. Describe the steps to reproduce it. If you are noticing that your browser is crashing, force it to crash again if you can, and document what you did to force it to crash again. That's super important. Also, search for duplicate bugs. If somebody else has already filed a bug like that, Bugzilla will do that for you. If you just write a good enough description, when you go to submit it, it will find any duplicate bugs and display them for you. And also, this isn't written on the slide, but if you're using a Unix type system, I don't know about Windows folks, but if you use a Unix type system, maybe put up a paste of your syslogs. That can be pretty useful. So you submitted your bug, and now you start sending emails to all the developers on the CC list. Hey, what about my bug? Hey, what about my bug? Don't do that. Just be patient, and when they do get back to you, try to respond to them in a timely manner too. So great. That's how you submit a bug. You sign up for a Bugzilla account, you click new, and you click through 2 menus just to find the right team to bug, and then you write a description. That's pretty easy, and that's a huge help for open source. Huge help. Now, what if you're a developer and you don't want to just submit bugs, you want to fix bugs? Now let's talk about hypothetical patch submissions. Caveat being, this isn't in-depth at all. This is just meant to sort of show you what the workflow looks like, to demystify it. Step 0, learn from my mistakes. The first patch I sent into the Linux kernel, the maintainer of the subsystem, it was for a webcam driver, started his email with ugh. Ugh, you're lumping a whole lot of changes together. So what I had done was, I had made one of the first mistakes you can with patch etiquette, is I had fixed a whole bunch of simple errors all in one commit. Don't do that, especially people who are using GitHub a lot and being really willy-nilly. I feel like they'll put a lot of changes into one commit and forget about it. That won't fly in these projects. One change, one commit. And that doesn't mean one line of text, by the way. That just means like one focused concept. Like, I'm changing the sleep time was one of them. That should be its own commit. Step 1, read the guidelines. That's what I should have read more closely. They're not really difficult. Mostly they just say to write a good commit message and split all of your changes into commits. It's very hard to make a commit that's too small. It's better to err on that side, actually. Right? And that's the basic ideas. Also, there's some funny style guidelines with the Linux kernel. They use 8 space width tabs for one thing. Basically, default Vim is the way that they prefer everything to be formatted, and which is really ugly and archaic, and it's especially weird when you think that they prefer, the width limit to be 80 characters, and they're using 8 space tabs. I don't understand. But read the coding style document and be sure to do that. So the first thing you're going to want to do is check out the repo. It's going to take a long time. This is a big repository. I mentioned that Greg KH is the maintainer of the staging branch. So if you're going to do development on the kernel, you're going to want to do development on the staging-next branch. So that's going to live here. You can look at the link later if you'd like. Go clone that. First thing I'd recommend you do when you clone it is, if you've never built the kernel, obviously, if you want to submit a patch, you need to start building kernels right away. So building a kernel is actually really trivial to do, especially to build a generic kernel. If you run Ubuntu or you run Mint, then you're going to want to actually build a Debian package, and then and then install the package, because there's some special stuff that has to go into the kernel insofar as modules go. But we won't worry about that. If you just want to run a Debian system and you don't need any fancy modules, just go into the source tree, copy over your old kernel configuration, and then make install, and then update grub. Really easy. There it goes. Just a GIF. Okay, so now you've built your kernel and you know that that's working. Go back into the source tree, check out the staging-next branch. That's the branch you want to develop against if you're going to submit a patch. Then check out -B, that creates your own new branch so that you can make some changes. Do some work. One place to start, and a tool that you're going to be using a lot anyways, is with just looking at source files that are already in the tree and trying to find style errors. There's a linter that ships in the scripts directory of the Linux kernel source tree, and you can just point it at a source file, and it'll be like, oh, there's a new line at the end of the file, or there's a space at the end of this line, and that should be removed. So you do that, you make a patch, and you want to send it in. Before you do anything, rebuild the kernel again. There was a really great, well, it wasn't great, it was really horrible. There was a really horrible tirade against some 18, 19-year-old kid from Europe who had submitted about a dozen patches to the kernel mailing list, that most of which broke the kernel when you tried to build it. He'd been making patches left and right and not building the kernel to test it. They banned him from the mailing list. And one of the kernel maintainers, who I think must be religious because he wasn't joking, said that he needed Jesus.
Sister, we all need the Jesus.
He said this kid needed Jesus because he thought this kid he had some serious emotional problems.
Oh.
Yeah, I didn't link to that, but if you just Google, you'll find that tirade. Poor kid. So the kernel builds. Nobody's going to tell you need Jesus. Go ahead and commit your patch. You could have done this before, but I just wanted to be extra safe. So don't even commit it if you haven't built yet. Commit your patch, and be sure to add a nice title and a very descriptive, body. And then at the bottom, it's very important to have this signed off by. Actually get. Oh, sorry.
Question. So does the Linux kernel not use any kind of unit testing or any kind of testing at all?
No.
Actually,
Holy crap, it's one of the main large open source projects that's still not on board with this.
Greg Crow-Hartman says that the way they test is if code compiles. If the code compiles, then it's good to go.
So the users are testers. Well, it's because the Linux kernel mode code is directly speaking to hardware. And so how can you test that except by
Virtual machines.
It's not the real hardware.
But then you're still just making sure that it builds. at that point.
I mean, you can write unit tests in C. You do that for embedded systems all the time.
That's true.
That
It's
sounds
too
like
much work to dummy the hardware that you're interfacing with. It's not worth it.
They
And
don't bother.
Dumbing it doesn't prove that it works. It proves it works against the development.
The Linux kernel is one of the fastest developing code bases in the world. It's also the largest. And they have discovered, and they have discovered that it's actually faster to make sure the code compiles, send it out, ship it, and then if it doesn't work, we can patch it, we can fix it after the fact.
But they're probably not doing static analysis either, are they?
No.
There are people that lent and do other things to it to verify that the code developed.
They do static analysis.
And you know what? It's an open source project, so if you want to do that, you can.
Well, yeah, you could.
They do that on the Android branch. Yeah.
You could certainly do that. No, it's all good. That's a good point. I was very shocked when I heard that as well.
Yeah.
I think, that's the way it goes, though. I think these guys are plugging in USB devices on their desk and saying it works. And that's what I did with that video driver. I had a webcam that I knew used that driver, and I plugged it in.
Yeah, the only reason why I bring that up is because some other open source projects, I'm thinking largely things in the Ruby ecosystem or even JavaScript ecosystem. If you don't have unit tests that go with your code and you're trying to do a pull request, then you're not going to get accepted. They're going to say, go write a test. Come back when you have something that works.
Yeah,
The kernel needs a Travis file.
Yeah.
Yeah, Linux is written in C,
It's
though,
a different
that's
culture.
thrilling.
Yeah, I'm just saying that's, well, I'm ignoring what you just said.
And there may be some tests tucked in there. I don't know, but I'm not familiar with that at all. And Greg Page did literally say we don't do unit tests in the kernel because we can't. But yes, that's a weird thing for sure. Oh, Git is special made for doing kernel development. With Git, you have the -S, the -S and -V options. You turn those on when you commit, and you'll get all this nice stuff like signed off by the kernel mailing list once. So it's really easy. The last thing you do after you've committed your patch is you just run another script that's in the source tree. It's a Perl script called git maintainer. You can be clever and pipe the output of git showhead, or you can just point it at the source file you worked on, and it will just print out a list of all the email addresses of maintainers who would be concerned about that file. You get that list, and I'll say you've surely set up get send mail. It's the easiest way to do it. And you put their email addresses into get send mail, and off goes your patch. Then just watch your email for a message that starts with UG. Sorry, was there a question? But I wouldn't recommend that you do that. Don't just go and try to submit a patch to fix some style error like I did. Instead, I recommend you try to do this challenge. This is maintained by people from the Linux Foundation, I believe, and it actually works. By the end of this challenge, you will be getting mentored support in getting patches into the kernel source tree. You work through these challenges, and you will get patches into the Linux kernel, and you'll be able to brag to your friends by saying git log. Okay, so that's it. I wanted to be sort of terse about that because my point was, and hopefully this point is what got across, is that kernel development is not a big and mysterious thing. It's just weird because it all happens through a mailing list. But once you set up git send mail, it's pretty painless. Just use that git maintainer's Perl script to find the email addresses that are important. Okay, so Mozilla development I feel is much, much easier. And this happens all through Bugzilla. You don't just submit bugs here. Code review happens through here as well. So the first thing you want to do is check out Mozilla Central if you're working on Firefox. There are a bunch of source trees with Mozilla, but Mozilla Central is probably the one that you're going to care about if you want to work on the browser. Unless you want to work on Servo, if you've heard of that, very interesting. So Mozilla maintains a GitHub that is synchronized to their internal repositories. They also maintain internal Git and Mercurial repositories, which is pretty confusing. So I'm just going to focus on the Mercurial repositories because that's always the first thing that's supported with Mozilla. But you can, if you want to use GitHub, go and find the Mozilla Central on GitHub and use Git to work with it. So check it out. Here's where you clone it from, hg.mozilla.org. That's easy. You cloned it. How do you build it? You just go into the Mozilla Central directory, mock build. I wrote some notes about dependencies that might not be satisfied. After it builds, mock run. And it's building, and it's just that easy. You'll find that it's a lot less painful than compiling a kernel, but for good reason. Then make some changes. Before you make changes, set up Mercurial. Mercurial is a funny thing. I saw a really good infographic about Mercurial one time. Git was a Swiss Army knife, and Mercurial was a corkscrew and a saw and a kitchen knife. Point being, if you don't set Mercurial up properly, you'll find yourself having to take a lot more steps than you would otherwise need to. So follow this link and set up Mercurial. It's really simple. It's copy-paste. And then use bookmarks with Mercurial. This is something that you can just look up on your own, but it's really simple, I promise. Say HG bookmark master, HG bookmark my awesome patch, and that's just like with Git saying git checkout -b. It's not just like it, but it has the same effect. Then, instead of worrying about getting your patch rejected, go and find a mentored bug. There's a long, long list, thousands of bugs, I think, that have mentors that will work with you to make sure that your patch eventually gets accepted, which is very important. When you're working on projects and you don't have a mentor, you can submit good code and it will get rejected because it's doing things in a way that the team doesn't philosophically agree with or doesn't agree with the team's roadmap, and you would have had no way of knowing that. So find a mentored bug or go into one of these two IRC rooms on irc.mozilla.org, Introduction to Developers, and just ask somebody, hey, what can I work on? They'll ask you, what are you interested in? And then you tell them. They'll find you something. Okay, so once you've signed up for your Bugzilla account already, I hope, and you found a bug that you want to work on, you don't have rights to take the bug, go in IRC. You have to go in IRC or leave a comment on the bug, but I recommend IRC, and ask to be added to the bug. Once you're added to the bug, make some changes, blah, 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 HG commit, your message just needs to be bug, the bug number, dash, etc., etc., and then R stands for reviewer equals your mentor's name, some comment about the changes you made, and then you use HG export to make that text file, which is the diff. You save that somewhere, and then you add it as an attachment to the bug, just like adding an attachment to an email. And you click add a reviewer down there, there's a little arrow to it, and that's it. If they get back to you and you've got some problem, you can just strip off your last commit and keep the changes, make some more changes, commit again, reattach another diff. Really simple workflow. Not as scary as what I had expected browser development to look like. And then it gets accepted, and you give yourself a big high five, and you've got some code in a pretty big code base. Cool. And so that's, I don't know if I'm over or under time, but
You've got 20 minutes.
I've got 20 minutes left.
Well, yeah, 15.
I mean, we can ask a lot of questions.
Sorry. I think one thing that I find interesting is that different open source projects seem to begin to have different cultures. And so there's different workflows depending on which major open source project that you're talking about. Some of the stuff in the Linux project kind of really surprised me. I'm more used to dealing with the Titanium Mobile project, which is another open source project. Its workflow is basically GitHub and Jira. And that's completely different than the workflow you described, but there are some commonalities. I didn't catch 100% of your talk. Did you mention the Eric ESR, how to ask questions? I usually throw that at people before even addressing them.
I think I may have linked to it. I have resources at the end, but yeah.
I usually tell them to read that and then get back to me.
Yeah.
They'll ask better questions.
Yeah. I think there's a link to something along those lines.
Yeah.
And I suggested people Google things quite a lot before they. But yes, the differences in cultures between projects are huge. Apache projects, they use Jira, and they're much different than GitHub projects. And I think GitHub project is becoming the de facto standard, though, because it's much easier, which encourages a lot of practices that won't cut it with the Linux kernel, which I think is a real pain point. One big thing, if you're working on GitHub a lot and you try to submit a patch to either Bugzilla or the Linux kernel, it's important to remember that once your patch goes, no more commits. A lot of people make a pull request on GitHub, and then they're like, oh, I forgot to add a period in my comment. Let me just add a period, and then they'll put in their next commit, and they'll push it, and it just magically appears on their pull request. And that's fine and dandy. If you try to do that with the kernel mailing list or with Bugzilla, you're going to end up with a lot of spam, and people aren't going to be happy with you. A lot of things like that. A lot of cultural problems come from getting your foot in the door by working through GitHub, I think, because it makes stuff so easy.
Yeah, Lynn Starwald actually made a comment about how it's too easy and he hates it, and went back to his old workflow.
Well, I think easy. I like easy sometimes.
I think he said that it lowers the bar too much and it lets too many idiots in. It's something along the lines of his actual comment.
Here's a fun task for everybody. Go find Linus Torvalds' kernel source tree on GitHub, and notice in the README it says, "Don't send me pull requests. All development happens through the kernel mailing list." And then look and see that there's like 50 pull requests, and new ones coming all the time. GitHub has lowered the bar quite a lot. It's good and it's bad.
It's like in school, they always make you do math out like long form first, and then once you got it, use a calculator or whatever.
Yes, if everybody started doing development with text-based patches, then maybe they would appreciate best practices a little more. But at the same time, let's all just be thankful that using version control has gone so mainstream. Because I can remember a time when people wanted to send me zip files with source. And GitHub, at the very least, made that an artifact of a bygone era. So. Anything else?
If you don't want to work on the kernel, or Firefox, not that either one of those projects is bad, but how would you go about finding a project?
Most of the advice, insofar as getting your foot in the door, holds true for every project. Go find their wiki, find what IRC channels they use, and find a mentor. If there's not a formal way of finding a mentor, go on the IRC channel, make sure that you're familiar with IRC Etiquette, and get yourself an unofficial mentor. That's the only way to get involved in a project, I find. A lot of times, like overeager kids I know in the old days would sort of get handed junk work to do by developers, and that would be their unofficial mentoring. But most of the time, there is some sort of onboarding process you can find in a wiki. And get on IRC, very important. I don't think that's a problem at PhreakNIC. I think most people here use IRC, but find those IRC channels.
Well, a website I found very useful when I was getting into Linux kernel was kernelnewbies.org. They have some amazing guides that are very oriented towards just total beginners.
Yes, very good, and they have a mailing list and they have an IRC channel.
And you can actually submit patches through their mailing list, so you have that buffer between you and the big scary kernel mailing list.
Yes, they will mentor for you. A funny thing, the kid who got banned from the kernel and was told to find Jesus, he was also banned from kernel newbies.
Oh, God.
I know. They don't want him at all. It's a real shame.
One thing I've seen in a lot of projects lately is they actually have a whole section of this auto tracker that's like low-hanging fruit.
Yes.
You know, really easy, like, first steps. I think finding projects that have taken that step is a good thing.
And Bugzilla has that for working on Mozilla projects. And also, this whole list, you just pick what you're interested in, and then what skills you have, what programming languages, and it will find you cherry bugs like that and a mentor, which is really nice. Anything else?
Can I ask an unrelated question?
Of course.
Why does the download manager in Firefox, and really in every web browser, still suck? Like compared to wget, like, you can't resume a download. It's 2014.
2014 what?
All right, how long have you been working there?
I've only been working in Mozilla for like a little over a month, actually.
That's perfect.
She's not responsible for this.
Just call wget indirectly.
Well, the problem is it has to support every platform. That's one thing.
Wget runs on every platform, or just on.
Well,
I'm just teasing about wget in particular, but why doesn't it support resume correctly? It has you can like pause and resume, but if the download fails, it will never correctly resume.
that's something I've seen floating around, actually.
As a
You know, that sounds like a personal itch that maybe you could get into Mozilla
I said it was
Development.
unrelated. All the questions to end. I've just never been.
If we go to Bugzilla right now,
Let's do it.
See, we're gonna fix it. This is perfect.
What's your email address?
I mean,
It's MRRH at, I can't remember the rest. Yeah, that's what.
Just seems like there's fewer vowels.
let's see if I can find this. Download manager, partially downloaded file won't resume, insists on restarting. It's unclaimed. It was filed in 2008. So right there's your bug.
Yeah.
If you will go in an IRC channel and say, I want to fix this. On Windows host, I guess you can install Sigwin?
Can I, but I can't, I don't use any proprietary, I don't perform Windows, but this exists everywhere. But how does, to get something patched into Firefox, would I have to build a Windows build? Or just a certain personal build would be enough?
So I'm not on the browser team.
Okay.
I think if you did a personal build for Linux, I think they'd be happy to take it. But I think just from what I've seen in a month is that a lot of problems arise when you want to support every platform, especially Windows.
Yeah. Does Mozilla use CLA licenses? The community contributed, whatever CLA contributed license agreement? Do they pull that shenanigan?
I don't believe so. No, I mean, if you want to start committing patches, you can just start writing patches. If you become a committer, there's a committer agreement you have to sign.
Right, but is that doing a copyright transfer?
I don't believe so. I believe it's just saying that you're not going to do bad things with your access to the repository.
That's an emerging trend that I'm noticing in a lot of open source projects, especially in corporate packages.
One thing about Mozilla is that it's nonprofit, so
Right, but it still has a for-profit arm as well.
sort of. Mozilla Corporation is not exactly for profit, though.
How does it all see?
Well, it exists as a way of bringing additional funds into the nonprofit, but basically by classifying themselves that way, they get a lot of advantages that a nonprofit doesn't have. That allows them to compete with Google and Microsoft, but still, all the money goes right back into the nonprofit. It's not there's no executives that are trying to raise funds for shareholders.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Thanks.